December 31st, 2025, the last day of 2025. The beginning of chapter 11, Buddha Dhamma, 11.1, Introduction, page 1053. Point A, Buddhism is a path of developing happiness. Happiness plays a vital role in Buddhist spiritual practice. It is fair to say that Buddhist practice is an inseparable form of happiness. The Buddhist teachings describe many names for happiness and classify it into various categories and stages, culminating in supreme happiness. Here are some examples of happiness found in the Tipitaka. Now, I'm going to read it in the Pali language first and give the definition in English. Pari bocha sukha, upa bocha sukha, happiness of consumption. Bocha sukha, happiness of material wealth. Kaya sukha, kayika sukha, physical pleasure. Seta sukha, seta sikha sukha, mental happiness. Kamma sukha, sense pleasure. Samisa sukha, amisa sukha, material happiness. Niramisa sukha, immaterial happiness. Utu sukha, seasonal happiness. Kiti sukha, happiness resulting from fame. Buchu chana sukha, happiness of ordinary people. Manusa sukha, human happiness. Dipa sukha, celestial happiness. Mahajana sukha, happiness of the multitudes. Sapaloka sukha, happiness of the entire world. Madhura sukha, sweet or intoxicating happiness. Kusala sukha, wholesome happiness. Dhammika sukha, righteous happiness. Pavana sukha, happiness of spiritual development. Nika sukha, frequent or constant happiness. Samsara sukha, happiness of the realm of rebirth. Yoga sukha, happiness of endeavor. Lokiya sukha, mundane happiness. Lokutraya sukha, transcendent happiness. Vatu sukha, happiness of the round of rebirth. Vivata sukha, happiness of the freedom from rebirth. Olarika sukha, coarse pleasure. Sukuma sukha, refined happiness. Samadhi sukha, happiness of concentration. Jhana sukha, happiness of jhana. Vipassana sukha, happiness of insight. Arya sukha, happiness of awakening beings. Anarya sukha, happiness of unawakened beings. Viveka sukha, happiness of solitude. Sandhi sukha, happiness of peace. Vimokkha sukha, happiness of mental liberation. Vimutti sukha, happiness of deliverance. Sambodhi sukha, happiness of awakening. Parama sukha, supreme happiness. In terms of the beginning of the stages of practice, Gautama Buddha stated that the merit, punya, is a name for happiness, sukha, and goodness for performing wholesome deeds. In terms of meditation or concentration, happiness is an important factor for giving rise to concentration, samadhi, as confirmed by Gautama Buddha himself. A happy mind becomes well established in concentration. In the Tipitaka, happiness is described as the proximate cause, patthana, for concentration. When the mind is highly concentrated and one reaches the state of absorption, jhana, sukha, happiness, is one of the factors, jnanaka, present up to the third absorption. Although happiness is technically not a factor for the concentration attainments, jhana samapatti, higher than the third jhana, these states are nonetheless considered to be more refined form of happiness. Finally, the highest goal of Buddhism is Nibbida. It's described as a form of happiness, the supreme form of happiness, parama sukha, release. This subject was discussed in the section on the state of mind of those who have realized Nibbida in chapter 7. An important synonym for Nibbida is nirodha, cessation, which is endowed with the three key attributes. The first one is the cessation of avijja, so the cessation of ignorance. This is equivalent to the arising of the supreme knowledge and vision, nana dasana, to the realization of truth, satcha. The second attribute is the cessation of mental defilements, kalesas, the elimination of mental impurities, the end of any root factor in the mind causing the distress for oneself and for others. And the third key factor is the cessation of dukkha, the cessation of suffering, the end of suffering, the attainment of supreme happiness. Although this third attribute, the ending of dukkha, the end of suffering, was described to some extent in the chapter on the Arihat's mental self-mastery, Bhavita Sita, there are several more aspects to this attribute that needs to be considered. Moreover, this highest goal of Buddhism, of awakening, a bodhi, or supreme happiness, is to be reached by way of happiness and through a practice comprised of happiness. It's not to be reached by way of suffering or through affliction or torment. Now, these are references by Gautama Buddha pertaining to his own practice. The word dukkha in this context refers to suffering as a result of self-mortification, dukkhara kirya. This should be confused with the term dukkha patipata and sukha patipata or patipati, of which the former simply implies refers to difficult or arduous practice, or in other words, extreme asceticism. The Nikantha is a sect of Jains. And remember, Buddhism is in the classification of Satana Dharma. So we have Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains, and so forth. So part of the sect of the Jains, the Nikanthas, had the belief that happiness cannot be reached by happiness. It can only be reached by pain. For this reason, they practiced severe austerities and self-mortification. Atta kila mata mu yoga. Before Gautama Buddha's awakening, he had the same understanding and thus practiced extreme austerities in vain for a long time. Quote, this is a good story about the Buddha when he was sitting and he dropped his body by practicing austere asceticism by not intaking food. And so he made a request for the bowl to be put in the river. And the story goes, you need to check it out when you get a chance, but the bowl actually flowed up the stream. And after the miracle happened, he actually accepted alms from a laywoman and stopped his austere practice. But he basically dropped his body to a skeleton. In relation to the Dhamma practice, the Tipitaka describes various kinds of happiness. And at the same time, they describe both the advantages and the faults of each kind. They also compare each kind of happiness with other kinds to point out how one is superior to another. This description of various kinds of happiness and their comparison to each other is a way of urging people to progress in spiritual practice and to develop superior kinds of happiness. Every person has the potential to progress in these various stages of happiness until he or she reaches supreme happiness. The comparisons of various kinds of happiness indicates that although lower levels of happiness may have favorable aspects, they are still imperfect. They still have both advantages, sasata, and disadvantages, atinawa. In order to gain a clear understanding and to progress in the Dhamma practice, it is essential to recognize these advantages and disadvantages. In this context, there is a third factor. One must also have a way out, nisarana, an escape where one is freed from both advantages and disadvantages, both from asata and atinawa, an escape from both of them. One then asks whether there is a way out, a way to pass beyond the state of incompleteness, a way to reach freedom and security, which one encounters a way out. Nitsarana, spiritual practice can progress. In sum, Buddhism acknowledges many different levels of happiness. Buddhism teaches that happiness needs to be cultivated. One can define the entirety of Buddhist practice as thus: cultivation of happiness. Buddhism is a system of developing happiness, and a development of happiness is given great emphasis in Buddhism. The second point, happiness is reached by happiness. It is often overlooked that Buddhism is a religion of happiness or a system of teaching of happiness. If one encounters such statements as life is suffering or all is suffering, one may think that Buddhism is permitted by suffering. When people see the Four Noble Truths, Arya Satcha, the Four Noble Truths with dukkha, with suffering, or they encounter the Buddhist words in relation to the Four Noble Truths, Arya Satcha, both in the past and both in the present, I teach only suffering and the end of suffering. Some people may be convinced that Buddhism is a teaching, a religion pervaded by suffering. People need to be constantly reminded that Gautama Buddha accompanied the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, Arya Satcha, with the four duties, kisa. If one performs these duties incorrectly, then one trips up for the very start. When one will not be able to reach the heart of Buddhism, especially in regard to the first noble truth, one needs to be as accurate as possible. If it helps, one can memorize the Pali phrase, Dukkham Arya Sakam Parineyam, meaning the noble truth of suffering should be thoroughly understood. Our responsibility in the face of suffering is comprehensive understanding. Suffering is to be thoroughly understood. Suffering is the matter to be taken up and addressed by wisdom, sound judgment, insight, investigation. It is not something to be accumulated in order to torment the heart. If one experiences suffering, uses wisdom to deal with it and bring it to an end, this is the beginning of the correct path of practice. One can look at the life of Gautama Buddha as an example. Before Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha, was awakened, he practiced severe austerities and extreme asceticism, which was the custom of renunciants at that time. It's good to note that at that time, these renunciants were all learned people. The society was a rich, flourishing society of nothing but scholars and learned individuals. When he realized that this was wrong form of practice, he abandoned these austerities and turned to the middle way of practice, Majjhima Patipata, or Patipatti, until he really reached awakening. This is a brief summary of the events. A close examination of this account from the Tipitaka provides a clearer understanding of Buddhism on the whole scale. In the Bodhi Raja Kumara Sutra, Gautama Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama Buddha recounts how, before his enlightenment, he had this thought. Happiness cannot be reached by way of happiness. It is only to be reached by way of pain. It was for this reason that he went forth into the renunciant way of life. He then went to live with two meditation masters at their hermitage. Afterwards, he undertook extreme ascetic practices with intensity and ardor, experiencing extreme physical pain, but all in vain. He realized that it is not possible to reach the supreme good by way of self-mortification. Note here in his words, the way to awakening must be otherwise. He remembered an event from his childhood when he was sitting quietly alone in the shade of a tree and had attained the first concentration of absorption, jhana, distinguished by bliss and joy. He had the insight that this is the path, as confirmed by the words he has spoke himself. Here indeed is the path to awakening. When he was clear in his mind about this issue, he asked himself whether he is afraid of happiness free from sensual pleasures and free from unwholesome states. This was a way to verifying whether the happiness contained any danger. He answered with confidence that he was without fear. He consequently abandoned the extreme ascetic practices, followed the path of happiness, which is represented by the term the middle way, Majjhima Patipata. Patipatti, and finally reach awakening. An important distinction in that many of the religious traditions in India or in Bharat at that time claimed that happiness cannot be reached by way of happiness. It is only to be reached by way of pain. Adherents of these traditions thus undertook extreme ascetic practice. In Sanskrit, it's called tarpas. Buddhism, however, teaches that happiness can be reached by way of happiness and thus encourage practitioners to abandon extreme ascetic practices, which are classified as self-mortification, atta kilamata nu yoga, and considered a waste of time. The most basic form of happiness is derived from coming into contact with external objects and is dependent on material things and is thus referred to as sense pleasure, kama sukha. When one has developed and assess a higher form of happiness, the superior happiness exists in tandem with sensual pleasure. Alternative, one may choose to abandon these sense pleasures altogether and only abide in a more refined kind of happiness. These superior forms of happiness prevents the dangers of dependence on material things. Indeed, they provide a greater degree of independence. One is able to experience happiness without needing to consume things. Note the phrase by Gautama Buddha above, happiness free from sensual pleasures and free from unwholesome states. One progresses in unison with wholesome desire, chanta, as we discussed in chapter 10 earlier or previously. A vital factor in this correct practice for promoting independence is wisdom. With wisdom, even if the refined form of happiness are sustained over a long period of time, they do not overwhelm the mind. One is not intoxicated. One does not forget oneself. True happiness goes hand in hand with freedom. Conversely, true freedom is endowed with happiness. One reason why the birth of Buddhism was so revolutionary, allegedly causing an earthquake and excitement all the way up to the highest Brahma realms, is because it introduced a new perspective and a way of life, the happiness that can be reached by happiness. The goal of Buddhism, supreme happiness, paramara sukha, is accompanied by wisdom, which frees the mind through understanding. This is genuine. Again, the goal of Buddhism, supreme happiness, parama sukha, is accompanied by wisdom, which frees the mind through understanding. This is genuine, independent, and secure happiness. It need not be searched for. It is free from any reliance on external things. It remains constant. Wherever one is bright, one is joyous, and one is happy. All of us who are aware of this principle of supreme happiness have the opportunity to develop ourselves in order to realize it. The key emphasis is the opportunity to develop ourselves in order to realize this happiness.